That was something, huh? I hope you enjoyed the reading of Martin Luther King Jr.'s Ware lecture to the UUs in 1966. When I hear those words, I feel that he is speaking to me now and gently reminding me to not sleep through the revolution. And I just want to say that writing a sermon for Martin Luther King Day Sunday is really tough. Anyone, I think, would feel very, very inadequate in any possible response to that magnificent man and his life. And to what it means for us now, so many years after his death. People must go to the streets with signs that say, as if we haven't learned this already, Black lives matter. In preparation for the sermons for this month, I read quite a bit about the history of nonviolence. Like all powerful ideas, it is possible to trace a kind of lineage. One person influencing another, passing the light along from one to another. I want to tell you this morning about some of the people who influenced Martin Luther King, his understanding of nonviolence, because they are very much part of our lineage too. Martin Luther King began reading the work of Gandhi while he was still in seminary. And Gandhi's teaching on truth force, satyagraha, was at the heart of Martin Luther King's life and action. But Gandhi, in turn, was influenced by the Russian novelist and radical pacifist Leo Tolstoy. And what were some of the influences on Tolstoy? This is where it gets really interesting for us as Unitarian Universalists. There were 3 19th century Americans whose ideas brought about a radically new way of thinking about peaceful social change, really never known before, and influencing generations after them. Henry David Thoreau was raised Unitarian, and his writings about civil disobedience influenced Tolstoy, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King. Aidan Ballou was a Universalist whose deep understanding of nonviolence provided the intellectual underpinning for future nonviolent action, and who founded a utopian community, Hopedale, based on the principles of universal love. William Lloyd Garrison was a journalist, a lifelong Unitarian, and a powerfully influential, nonviolent, anti-slavery abolitionist. I want to tell you a little bit more about William Lloyd Garrison, born to a poor family in Massachusetts in 1805. Every book on the history of nonviolence starts with William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison understood instinctively, and as a matter of his deep religious faith, that slavery was built on a foundation of violence and coercion. In the 1830s, he called for the immediate, peaceful liberation of all 2.5 million slaves and a boycott of elections until slavery was ended. He rejected all violence, explaining that to attempt to cure an evil by violence leads to greater evils. While at the same time, he stirred people to action, reminding them of the moral imperative to respond to injustice. And Dr. King echoed those understandings when he spoke these famous words: "Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." And Garrison understood, as Dr. King did, that our interrelationship with one another is the highest law. Garrison wrote in 1838, "Enslave the liberty of one human being, and the liberties of the world are at peril." Many Unitarians and Universalists were devoted to the struggle for the abolition of slavery and later for civil rights. So when Dr. King in 1955 called on people of faith from around the country to join him in Selma after the Bloody Sunday March, when demonstrators were met by brutal police violence, many Unitarian Universalists answered that call and went to Selma. Some of you may know that 2 white UUs died in Selma. Viola Liuzzo was the mother of 5 young children from Detroit, Michigan, who traveled to Selma to be a support for the marchers, and was shot and killed by the Klan. One of the shooters was an FBI informant. The Reverend James Reeb was a community minister who lived and worked in a poor, mostly black neighborhood of Boston. When King issued his call to ministers, Reeb answered without hesitating, along with many other UU ministers. Reeb was walking home from a meeting in Selma when he was attacked by a group of white men. One hit Reeb on the head with a club, and he died 2 days later, on March 11th, 1965. His murderers were later arrested, tried, and acquitted by an all-white jury. Dr. King himself preached Reverend Reeb's eulogy. He began with a passage from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. "And if he should die, take his body and cut it into little stars. He will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night." And Dr. King went on to say, "These beautiful words describe the radiant life of James Reeb. His crime was that he dared to live his faith. He placed himself alongside the disinherited black brethren of his community." I'm going to read some other passages from this eulogy. Hang on, because he didn't mince words. People wanted to know who had killed James Reeb, but Dr. King saw his death as part of a larger system of injustice. And as you hear this, reflect on whether this is still true today. James Reeb was murdered by the indifference of every minister of the gospel who remained silent behind the safe security of stained glass windows. He was murdered by the irrelevancy of a church that will stand amid social evil and serve as a taillight rather than a headlight, an echo rather than a voice. He was murdered by the irresponsibility of every politician who has fed his constituents the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. He was murdered by the brutality of every law enforcement agent who practices lawlessness in the name of law. He was murdered by the timidity of a federal government that can spend millions of dollars a day to keep troops in South Vietnam, yet cannot protect the lives of its own citizens seeking their constitutional rights. So in his death, James Reeb says something to each of us, black and white alike. Says that we must substitute courage for caution. Says to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered him, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produced the murder. His death says that we must work passionately, unrelentingly, to make the American dream a reality. So he did not die in vain. James Reeb did not die in vain. The day after his death, there were impassioned speeches in Congress decrying his murder, and President Johnson, who had been hesitating to act, instructed his aides to begin working on voting rights legislation. James Reeb didn't set out to be a hero, and most likely he didn't think of himself that way. He followed his conscience where it led him. The greatest danger of having heroes is that we forget that the potential for heroism lies within each one of us. Of course, we teach our children in school about Martin Luther King and Gandhi, but are they taught to believe that they could and must manifest such courage in their own lives? And I think no one knows this better than the person who has been anointed a prophet. This is what King himself had to say at James Reeb's funeral. One day, our nation will recognize its real heroes. They will be the thousands of men and women with a noble sense of purpose that enables them to face fury and hostile mobs. They will be anonymous, relentless young people, black and white. They will be old, oppressed Negro women. They will be ministers of the gospel who are willing to march for freedom, to go to jail for conscience sake. Here and there, an individual or group dares to love and rises to the majestic heights of moral maturity. I want to honor Martin Luther King Jr. today and every day, but Dr. King was murdered a long time ago now. I don't want him to turn into a magnificent portrait on the wall, or the stamp that I put on my envelope, or a rhetorical, I have a dream that never becomes a reality. He wouldn't want that. I want to keep him alive in my own life by asking myself every day, what does it mean to live a life of moral courage, moral maturity? Am I living that life? And each of us must answer these questions in our own way and for ourselves. A few years ago, I gave a sermon at my seminary in which I made a confession that I haven't fully lived a life of moral courage, that I want people to like me, and I hate getting crosswise with people who have power over me. And I described my motto as, do what's right if you can get away with it and no one gets too angry. And in that sermon, I made a vow that I would, as a person called to the ministry, do my best to grow beyond this cowardice. I would do my best not to remain silent or refuse to act out of a fear of how the truth might hurt my career, my livelihood, my reputation, or even my life. And in these last few years, since I made that vow, I've had a few opportunities to stand up for what my conscience called me to do, and it's really scary, but also very powerful, to stand on what feels most true. It is an unmistakable, unshakable feeling. Satyagraha, truth force, soul force. We can speak from that ground when a friend is bullied or a child is mistreated. We can stand up for the earth, for the climate, for our neighbors, for the native peoples whose land we stand upon, for people without homes, or even for ourselves, because sometimes it's important to stand up for ourselves. And I truly believe, that if we each do this, if we each dare to love, a great, radically inclusive love for the earth and its peoples, if we find in ourselves moral courage and resolve, then Violo Liuzzo, Reverend James Reeb, and Dr. King himself will not have died in vain.